Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The webinar will begin in 1 minute. Hello, everyone, and welcome to ForDiscovery's webinar, Internal Investigations During COVID. I'm Will Riss with ForDiscovery, and thank you for joining us for this 60-minute presentation. Our presenter today is Melody Haas. Melody is the head of client success at ForDiscovery, a B2B digital forensic firm headquartered in Chicago. Melody has a decade of digital investigation experience and has worked consulting on cases for government entities, law enforcement agencies, political campaigns, and corporations. Melody has conducted research and analysis on projects related to due diligence, litigation, security, political, sports, and workers' compensation matters. She enjoys solving problems and assisting organizations with developing strategies to collect, preserve, and analyze electronic data. In addition to her work at ForDiscovery, Melody is a frequent speaker on computer forensics and electronic discovery topics, and you can read her most recent published article in the January 2021 edition of CEP magazine. Melody, we'll hand it over to you.
Yay! It's always so good to be back talking to people about the things that I get to do every day that are pretty cool. Today we're going to be talking a lot about internal investigations. We're going to give a little state of the union. I'm going to talk a little bit about how COVID has impacted work in general. Then we'll walk all through the strategy and consulting, collection, preservation, the analysis portion, and go through this the way we normally would have in one of these internal investigation matters. As we go through, I'm going to give a lot of stories and anecdotal pieces of how things have worked in COVID in our office ever since this all began, and how things have even changed just in our own practices and the things that we see, to give you a little bit of better insight into how this is impacting these investigations. So if you joined me a few months ago, I think it was in November, we did a webinar on how to protect data during the work from home era. In doing that, I cover a lot more about how COVID has impacted us. But generally speaking, a lot of folks went to work on like a Thursday or a Friday. You know, they're like, hey, peace out, have a good weekend. And by the time Monday rolled around, nobody was allowed back in the office. A ton of companies had to scramble to figure out, how do I make sure that these people have IT resources? How do I make sure I get those collaborative software programs so that they can work remotely? It was a big switch for many companies, including our own office. And by and large, throughout that process, businesses went digital. Usually it takes a year plus for companies to make decisions regarding new platforms that they're going to add. They were doing this in a matter of more like 10 days. That kind of exponential growth in terms of how the environments change at these businesses definitely impacts all of these investigations as well. And now data is literally stored everywhere. For all those folks who didn't get a work machine, they might be working on a Byod device. They may have used work phones before. Now they're using their cell phone to conduct a lot of business. So many things have changed. And where that data is stored is kind of everywhere. It's in the cloud, it's on work machines, at the company, it's at home. It's really sporadic as to where these sources reside. How it's really impacted investigations is really on the front side. Being able to identify the sources of evidence that are going to be necessary for the investigation and how we collect it. Those are the two things that have primarily changed the most. Most analysis and reporting is still standard. Not a ton has changed there, but I will talk about how it has impacted maybe some of the requests for those items as I go through. So prior to COVID, we had a pretty diverse litigation support practice. We always had people in the middle of accidents, harassment cases, um, any type of like injury, wrongful death, you name it. What happened in COVID is a lot of the cases that we work on really shifted. The trade secret non-compete portion of our business drastically increased because a ton of people left their current jobs to go work somewhere else, or they started new competing firms. So a lot of our work was really based around that. Also, a decent amount of employment fraud happened. Doing some of these investigations, we also learned that some people definitely weren't working, even though they were being compensated for it. That's pretty sketchy. A lot of incident response at the beginning of the year, before people had really taken the security seriously of all of these platforms. Even throughout this time, you even see places like Zoom adding extra security because of all those incidents that happened in classrooms. And then for the first time ever, we got brought contact tracing cases because of COVID. People know that mobile devices we pretty much have on us all the time. And so it's really a piece of interest, especially for employers that may have had some type of spread at work, to see where else did these people go? Did it really start there or not? And then we also have a completely separate section, which is a lot of businesses that we used to work with on internal investigations. We're either working on some type of merger or acquisition, some type of other business related transaction that had contracts that went along with it. And so we started getting asked to authenticate documents more frequently. Just in general, a lot of changes in where things went. And that was probably largely due to the fact that a ton of litigation was already tied up in court. So scoping, still as important as ever. Chad always likes to call it the 3 whys. A person says, I want to image a phone. You're like, why? Because there's text messages on it. Okay, yeah, but why? Oh, because I think that this person was sending, nudes to their coworker and harassing them. We really have to get down to what is going on in these cases. So the constraints really come down to scope. How difficult is it going to be to obtain these devices? Is it even accessible for us to collect in the first place? In terms of timing, how fast do you need this? Is it even technically feasible to get information like that to you in time? And is third-party data control an issue? Especially now that we're dealing with a lot of people working from home who might be using their own devices, this becomes a really tricky situation during the COVID era. And cost. We know that a lot of companies are struggling. And so cost is becoming a much more difficult thing for people to want to have and to want to spend during COVID. And so realistically, those are going to be the constraints. But ultimately, we still have to define that success. What's going to make this project, sing? What does that best case scenario look like for you? And as people who are third parties that are brought in to assist with these issues, whether it's outside counsel, digital forensics firms like us, somebody always calls you and you get this like, hey, something happened. I think I need to do this. And it takes a while to sort of gather all the facts and figures. And so usually when somebody comes to you, a lot of information is missing. That's even more increased during the COVID era. Simply because people aren't working next to each other anymore. It's much more difficult to walk over, to the door next door and knock on it and say, hey, do you have a minute to talk about this? And so now it's really important that we use these kickoff calls and meetings to bring all the parties to the table that might need to assist with this investigation. You want to make sure that it's the people with the specific knowledge, maybe it's HR or IT, who originally found the source of the issue. The specific roles, so for folks like us as forensic investigators, maybe you're working with a private investigator or a corporate investigator. And those people that have the decision-making authorities, usually the attorneys or executives. And it's important to get all of us together so that we can talk about what's technologically feasible, as well as what is the company's real interest, because we understand that the customized solutions have really been more of a request during the last year or so. And all of that's critical to make sure that we get all the information that we need for this project and to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So we're all swimming the boat and we're all rowing in the same direction. So what type of data matters? Well, it really depends on what are you trying to prove or disprove. And most people, like we work with clients that we've been working with for years. And a lot of them over the past few years were already starting to make some of those changes where they migrated from, Exchange to Office 365. And so when we think about the types of data that are contained in certain systems, that might have changed as some people migrate across these platforms. They might be generating new types of data that they didn't even have before. And so really, we want to make sure that we collect enough data that we're going to be comprehensive, but not so much that it's going to cost you a ton of money, and not so little that we have to go back and keep recollecting other pieces here and there. So just for the practice tip, just make sure that you ask if there are any new types of data. One of the things that I've seen increase a lot in the last year or so are digital signature services. So those DocuSigns, we use PandaDoc here at ForDiscovery. So making sure that you incorporate all of these potential items into that pool. And where is it? By and large, a lot of it's in the cloud these days, right? And employees touch a ton of different systems. You might have your local network shares that people are most likely VPNing into. Computers, tablets, phones, Office 365, G Suite. I mean, you name it, people are on it. This year, we've seen an increase in the amount of people using Microsoft Teams. And it largely came when they converted over to Office 365, they started adding in the other components with it as well. And so you always want to make sure that you ask about anything that has been added within the last year, because so many companies made a lot of changes to their environment. BYOD. Oh boy. If you go back a few months, I talk about BYOD a lot more when we talk about the work from home era. For a lot of companies, realistically, the easiest thing for them to do was to say, hey, do you have a computer at home? Great, use that, it's fine. But a lot of problems come along with bring your own device. And it really can impact the scope, timing, and cost of any investigation that you're planning on taking on. So typically, it does require the permission of the employee to access anything that's on a personal device or account. So in some situations, before companies added cloud storage, maybe employees would informally sort of use Box or Dropbox or something else to help transfer data back and forth between each other. And so all of those things are likely not company owned. They were done outside of the care and control of the company. They belong to the employee, and you're going to have to actually get their permission and cooperation to access that data. And they're realistically, their own administrators. So unless there was some type of device management or mobile device management or data loss prevention software, that would be very difficult for you to be able to obtain without that kind of permission. And then what are your standard practices? We still have to consider, how are you supposed to access this for internal investigations? Did you have a policy? How are you performing litigation holds on this type of data? And, when they're leaving, do they have to sign something that says that they've destroyed this data? Because sometimes the internal investigation might actually start after the employee leaves the company. These are all real things that you have to consider when you're looking at a BYOD case. And the practice tip is it always complicates investigations. So we still always have to be working towards this goal. That's never changed throughout the switch to the COVID era. Realistically, the hardest part is getting everybody in the same place and coordinated. At the beginning of the year, when everybody was scattered and we all hadn't settled into this work from home routine, a lot of resources got wasted because it was a lot of who's on first, who has the ball, oh, this person over here has it, oh, that person's sick or they're spending time with their kids on remote learning. So we had to get past all of that. It's running a lot smoother now, but realistically, not having all the parties together did make it difficult. So realistically, we're always going to be looking for what's the end game, what's it worth, is it even feasible? Like if it would cost more to do it than it's actually worth, probably a non-starter, right? But we want to make sure that with all that coordination time that we put into it, that we leverage all of that information with the goal to build that roadmap to make sure that we don't waste time, energy, or resources, so that we're really budget conscious through this process. My husband actually works for a company, and they were in the process of updating their employee handbook right before COVID started. So he felt awesome. He was like, yeah, yay, I'm like making all these final changes. Yeah, then COVID happened. Literally, they had to write all of these new policies and procedures and things to go inside of their employee handbooks, and they had to have whole new procedures for certain types of environments that employees worked in. And that wasn't the only thing that changed either. In multiple states, they've added additional privacy laws. They've added some other information. Some states are now making it harder to have non-compete agreements that stick. And so there's a ton of things that also changed during 2020 that weren't related to COVID. So just make sure that all of those agreements and policies that usually speak to the things that you're going to be investigating, it's almost always something from the employee handbook, some of those confidentiality agreements, all of that stuff needs to be updated to incorporate the changes that have happened in the environment. And they need to be acknowledged regularly by people so that everybody's still on the same page. One of the things that I've found really interesting throughout the course of this year is how many cases we got pulled in on where the employee literally wasn't working on their machine at all. We've had numerous ones of those. And so, usually when you get to, based on our examination of the data available, there's no evidence of, we typically think of no evidence of wrongdoing. In this case, it's almost flipped and said, there's no evidence that this person was ever doing their job. And so the way that we're framing evidence and the ways that we're looking for these holes and these gaps has definitely changed throughout COVID. So to sum it up, when we're working as an investigative team alongside all those fun folks, we have that facts pattern, we have our ESI, we have what we want to know, and where all of that aligns over the top of each other, we get what we call the good stuff. This was all thanks to me and Chad sitting around one day. We're like, really? It's like where they interact. It really is. So we'll talk about forensic collections. Now more than ever, it has become really, really important that everything is preserved. Often when an employee departs a company, there's a tendency to delete an account or reassign an account, maybe because it was a position-based account as opposed to something specifically for a person. Maybe equipment was wiped and reassigned to somebody else. All of those things will make it very difficult for a forensic exam to take place. Because anytime these accounts are changed, modified, updated, it could literally change thousands of entries. We always like to say that there's no such thing as a previous last access date. Still true today. So how do you collect? Realistically, think of our constraints. Scope, timeline, budget, all play a role in how we're going to collect this data. During COVID, we saw a drastic switch to remote collections. Pre-COVID, we had a healthy mix of on-site examinations where one of our forensic examiners, who you've probably met before, would get up, go to a client site, and image something in an attorney's office. Then we had the version where people would come to our office, give us their phone, walk away for 4 hours, go have some coffee, some lunch, have a meeting or two, come back and pick it up. All of that sort of fell by the wayside, both between, our conscious efforts to make sure that our forensic examiners aren't exposed to a ton of people if it's not necessary, and other people not wanting to be exposed to other people if it's not necessary. And so a lot of our clients have actually requested the remote collection route or tried to find a way that minimizes the human contact, which is great for all of us. But what you can collect and how you have to collect it is largely based on things like type and size of data storage, where is it physically, the age and the volatility of the data, encryption problems. Sometimes the ownership might actually play a part. I'll give some examples of that in a few slides. And we might be able to look at if there's any alternate sources or backups or something else we might be able to get that might be an easier solution. So for hard drives, computers, and servers, it's pretty much been the same thing it's always been. You can make a complete copy, or you can grab subsets of data. Forensic images are hands down the best for these, right? Complete bit-by-bit copy, we can go back and verify it. Other forensic firms can verify what we did. We can go back and look at any type of data from any time that exists on that machine, no recollection necessary. We even get to look for all the deleted stuff when we do those full collections. A sparse collection is simply a collection of a subset of data. We see this a lot more in things like servers, where maybe you don't need all the stuff from HR, maybe you don't need all the stuff from finance, you actually just need the stuff from the sales and the marketing team. So rather than collect an entire server, we just go in, snatch a little piece of it, and do our analysis on that. It's also really common for specific items. In our incident response work, we work a lot with logs, and the logs tell us a lot about the activity that happens on servers and different machines. Same thing with EHR. When you're dealing with health records, you usually aren't grabbing every patient's data. You're only grabbing the data for a specific patient that you're looking at in your analysis. This also comes down for lit holds. You know, most of the time it's just, hey, we stored the emails. Most of the time, that's what companies are looking for. And so there is a reason that sparse collections do also apply. There's both hardware and software options available to do most of this work. It's really going to vary based upon the make, model, and device. And some allow us to actually do work over the network to have a more covert investigation tinge. We've had to do that multiple times, where we used to have to go in at night, install an agent while nobody was there, or work with IT to do it. And then once that machine came back into the office, we were able to get in and look at it. Those things are still possible. Most of this, though, can really be done remotely these days. So yeah, the practice tip, collecting that make, model, and size information earlier really helps us help scope the project with you. So when you call up and you say, hey, how much would it cost to do X? If you give us that information up front, we can actually tell you what the options are. Is this something we need to do remote? Can we ship a drive to you that has some software on it? Or is this something that we actually need to have shipped to our office? So remote collections, biggest change by far in our practice during COVID. The process is really simple. We just need to know what it is. We need to know where it is. We need to send a kit to a willing participant who's going to help us access those data sources. We literally hop on the phone with them, make sure everything's working right. We do the collection of the data, and then all they have to do is package it all up and ship it back to our office. It really helps cut down on time, energy, and effort spent on these collections. It lowers costs. It's safe and secure. Everybody's happy when we do it this way. And we can also modify any type of discovery protocols to accommodate for this, and to accommodate for confidentiality of data as well. Collecting cloud data. This has changed a lot over the last few years. It used to be that only a few platforms allowed you to access your own data. But because of things like the GDPR, companies getting sick of having subpoenas sent to them, and a whole host of other things, they've now added a lot of basically user takeout functionality. Typically, you just need the credentials and two-factor codes. And it's really going to vary as to what you get based upon the account type and the service plans available. So for instance, Office 365 has a ton of different modules, and some of the best stuff is in the E5. And so if you're not up to a plan that's at that level, you're not going to be able to get a lot of the good stuff. Slack is sort of the same way, though whatever plan you have dictates what type of data you can get. And so knowing those things up front, like that make, model, device information that we had, what plan do you have on some of that corporate enterprise software, also can help us scope out the best way to do this collection. As I said, many platforms have this takeout feature. It just requires cooperative access, so going back to the credentials and the two-factor codes. Sometimes we do have to use specialized tools that are built to connect to the server or the data source to collect data using an API. That's an application programming interface. You can literally think of it as a bridge that goes between the two sources. It makes them talk together. Not all data that comes out of exports can actually be seen by users. Sometimes there's extra data that you have to build specialized tools to access. That happens in places like iCloud and some other places. And some places even rate limit how much data we can export at a time. So it might be a slow, cumbersome process if there's a lot of data. And to make it even weirder, sometimes it comes out in really weird formats. So Slack comes out in JSON. It's really messy. And to get it into a usable format, usually we get a request to flip it into HTML so it looks more like Slack. It's easier for people to read. Instagram also has really gross JSON. Gmail has an mbox with no folders. So for all of us who are used to seeing PSTs, Gmail looks really crazy when it first comes out. So sometimes we actually have to help with formatting and putting it back together in a way that makes sense. Mobile data, always my favorite. How do you get it? It depends. That's really the answer we're always going to give you. Mobile phones, unlike computers, have so many versions, makes, models that impact almost everything about it. Even the carrier can impact what we can get off of some devices. So yes, we use specialized tools. We try to get as much information as possible. Off of most of the newer devices, we're not going to get that physical extraction, that one-to-one, bit by bit copy that we would get from computer hard drives. Really not something that is common in the current era of mobile phones. And it's also potential that some of this data isn't even stored on the phone in the first place, which we'll talk about in a second. So where is this mobile data? Some stuff really is on the phone. Think of like SMS and MMS messages, literally in the database on the phone. Sometimes it's just a platform to view data that's online. So think about all those people that have Facebook installed on their phone. Realistically, your whole Facebook account isn't on your phone. That's not the best place to collect it. The best place to collect that is actually through the Facebook profile download. And so cloud collection options often augment some of the work that we need to do on phones. And then some data that's even stored on the phone isn't really accessible. A great example is iOS email. We're not able to extract that from a phone. So the best thing to do is actually go to the account that was actually connected to that and get it from there as well. And then WhatsApp is actually stored in a completely different place if you're using an Android. So lots of things that can change there. So for data access gotchas, just remember, data always has a way of disappearing. If somebody finds out that you're investigating them, most likely weird stuff's going to start happening. Computers are going to be broken, phones are going to get traded in, and they're going to do everything as possible before you tell them that they have a duty to preserve. So always collect prior to interviewing people or during an interview with people. That was a common request that we used to get. It was, hey, we're going to meet with this guy at 12 o'clock. We would like you to come and we're going to ask him to surrender those devices while he's here. So he couldn't grab them, go home, delete a whole bunch of stuff, play games for a few weeks, and then all of a sudden what we get is not what he even had at the time of the collection. We've had that happen so many times. It's also really tricky because all of this data is owned by different people. So when we think of, if we were to image a server that's sitting in a closet on a job site, right? That's hardware that is owned by the company. They have complete and full access to it. We can get it. With all of this migration to the cloud, those physical servers are owned by places like Amazon. Amazon's not going to let us go in there to do a complete collection and image all of their S3 servers. Not going to happen. So what it comes down to is trying to figure out which data sources we can get access to easily, which ones we might need to request extra assistance for, and which we just know we're not going to get access to. So making sure that we have valid login credentials, we can get that two-factor code, looking at encryption, timeliness, all of that. So I want to give some examples of where things get tricky. And these are some common ones that have happened in the cases that we've worked on. And this still continues into this day. So let's say the user's phone is employer owned. Really cool. When companies give their users phones, that's awesome. They're able to do a lot of stuff in there. Problem, companies don't usually set up iCloud accounts. And so what ends up happening is these people say, hey, I want to have all those apps that I have at home. And so they connect it to their iCloud account. So these devices are backing up to their cloud accounts. So even though that device is owned by the employer, all of that data is sitting in a personal account owned by the custodian. We also have an example that, let's say the user is communicating with the native mail app on an iPhone via a Gmail account. As I just talked about, if you're using that app, we're not going to get that data. We're going to have to go to Gmail to collect it from that source instead. Forensic analysis is one of the things that has not changed a lot during COVID. We still go back to our scope. We still try to figure out what's going on, what's happening. The mandate, tie everything back to scope. And clients have gotten a lot better at coming up with smaller scopes for projects in general. Pivoting off of events. This is always my favorite part of an investigation. So typically what we do is we look at very specific items that we think traditionally show some sort of activity that's of interest. So typically we always looked at after hours logons because it was like, hey, what's a sketchy person doing it like the night before they leave, right? But now one of the things that's actually happening is that's less of an ask because a lot of people are worried about co-employment, people being on the clock and being paid for a job that they're not actually doing. And so something as simple as the hours that we're looking at, we typically have to look more at a 24-hour day now, as opposed to being able to knock it out to sections. Internet activity is still a big thing. Wi-Fi connections are great. In one case that we worked on quite a while ago, my favorite thing was we found the guy logging into the competitor's Wi-Fi. That's definitely not something that was a good finding for him. But still, all of this other stuff applies. People are still interested in what files are being accessed, what's being shifted out to USB devices, cloud storage accounts, emails. None of that changed during COVID. Keyword searching. Keyword searching has been pretty much the same. People are usually interested if they're communicating with themselves or somebody else using personal accounts. They're still worried about those competitors. They're still worried about the clients that they may have taken or not as they're leaving. And those names of important files. People are starting to get better at understanding what files are really important within their departments, that if they lost it, it's like the keys to the kingdom. For instance, my husband works for a government contractor, and one of the things that's really important in government contracting to keep secret is rate sheets. And so if something like that leaves, it's a really big deal. And so there are certain types of information you're still going to want to focus on. That hasn't changed. So as long as you can give us a description of what type of data you need, we can help write the search syntax. Hash-based searching has become a lot more popular within this last year. We've worked on a lot of trade secret non-compete type cases in 2020. And a lot of it came down to having an agreement to remediate it at the end. And so a lot of times what we do is we make a list of files that hit a certain amount of keywords. We send that off to attorneys. They review what type of data belongs to the company, what type of the data belongs to the individual. And then we actually use hashes to go back in and remediate those files and make sure that they don't have access to things that they aren't supposed to have access to anymore. And so it's really important in that step. One of my favorites that's become a lot more important is block-based and fuzzy searching. So imagine somebody takes your contract, that thing that you use to run your business, and it has all these special terms and conditions and great wording. But what happens when they start working for the competitor? One of the things that they might take with them is a contract. So we know from hashing that if you change the substance of a file, it will have a different hash value. So in this case, let's say they started working for Halo Corporation and you were Acme Corporation. We can run some searches to find similar documents so that we can find where they might have made some small changes, but substantively, the documents are mostly the same. Filtering data, it's really interesting because I feel like some of our filtering has gotten longer term throughout COVID. So what's happened is, it's harder for people during COVID to have that same human connection with employees. So typically, when you think to what does an employee who's potentially an insider threat, what do they look like from that psychological perspective? You typically start to look at their attitude, how they're behaving, all the word choices that they use when they're in meetings. And that's much more difficult to ascertain that psychological state when we're all working from home. Because the best you have is a Zoom call. And if the person chooses not to turn on their camera, how are you even going to be able to read their face? So we're finding that some of the bad actions are starting way longer before somebody recognizes that there's a problem. And so our date filtering has to be expanded a little more than it used to be. So we always like to say to be careful by limiting your data set because you might miss something. Deleted data. Deleted data is still always an it depends. Nothing has changed here. We can tell some information about deleted files. It just depends on, did they use software to delete it? Have they overwritten it already? Or is it still just sitting in the recycle bin? A lot of people think they deleted stuff, but they never clear that thing out. Analyzing mobile data. I love mobile data analysis. So most of the analysis that can be done on traditional ESI, we can do on mobile devices, but it is a lot more tricky. Most data stored on a phone is in a database format. So when you think about a Windows computer, you usually think about loose files. My Word documents, maybe my PST file, some of the internet history stuff. We think about it in those kinds of contexts. A phone is really just a giant series of databases. So being able to query those databases and extract useful information out of them takes a little bit more time and effort because there's millions of applications and forensic tools haven't necessarily built out profiles for all of those applications, which means that forensic examiners in our office, like for those of you who have worked with Nate, he is really good at parsing through some of these weird databases. But that takes time, energy, and effort, and it makes the exam more expensive. And so a typical request might not cover all of the items. I put on here, this is a text message, this is an iMessage. And I put it up there for a very specific reason. If somebody said, give me all the text messages, to me, that would usually mean SMS and MMS. But if you say all communications, including chat applications such as iMessage, you're able to get a much more complete section of data. And a lot of people are now using WhatsApp. We have a case that we're working on right now where every single custodian used WhatsApp to communicate with each other. And so without somebody making that initial request, we have to make sure that it's actually captured in the collection and that we have it for analysis, because it's a lot more difficult to collect for Android than it is for iPhones. And phones benefit greatly from timeline analysis. And for those of you who've seen our presentations before, we've talked about this in a couple different ways. But going back to Bob and Susie, if we just asked for those text messages, we would only see that Bob and Susie sent each other 4 text messages. Really wasn't anything salacious, nothing crazy here. But when we flip over and we look at the entirety of what was happening on Bob's phone, we get a very different story. We get the story of a guy who was getting ready to hit on / try to sleep with his coworker. And so if all we did were capture those text messages, we would be missing all of the other stuff that happened that set the context for these conversations. Reviewing and producing ESI. It's been a year where a lot of our clients are now moving to review platforms. I would imagine that some of that is largely because people aren't in the office anymore. So we've been doing a lot more productions to those companies that do relativity hosting or NextPoint. And how we extract this data from phones and computers is really up to what the software platform requires. But we can still make things like timelines and spreadsheets don't require that. But if you are working with a review platform company, just know that we can always work with them to get the data in there in a way that makes sense for you. But just note that, remember, those single records are often useless without context. So what we like to say is when we're working with chat messages, looking at strings as opposed to individual messages might give you some better context. So how does forensics actually fit in with investigations? I like to use the example of Criminal Minds. Why? Because my mom is pretty convinced that I'm a cross between Penelope Garcia and Spencer. She thinks that basically I'm the two of them smashed together. And so when I thought of this show, I thought of hey, here's all these investigators that have all these specialties and they have the nerd back in the office. The nerds back in the office tend to be us folks on the forensic side. So forensic artifacts are just things. There's millions of them on machines. What it really matters is that we're able to filter out noise and get you data that's helpful for your investigations. So we're just as much of a part of the investigative team as possible. The more information that you give us about things that you find, things that you suspect, time frames, dates, anything you can give us, we can help try to give you information that will hopefully help you solve some inquiries that you have and fill in some gaps. Because remember, the digital meets physical at some point. I always think of, I worked at a place where there was some shenanigans and there was some fraud that happened. And they didn't realize it was happening until a receipt actually came into the office for something. And people got really confused. They're like, I've never heard of that vendor before. Why are they sending us an invoice? I don't even remember any of us saying we're going to work with them. And when we got down to it, it was somebody had started a company. They were trying to self-deal, and they were trying to get themselves in as approved vendor. Those aren't really the types of things that we might necessarily find on a machine unless you tell us about the physical components that came into the office. Because sometimes those paper documents are really going to support the stuff that we find on the electronic side. The key here is really collaboration. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. Especially now that we don't get to have a lot of those good face-to-face meetings, having stand-up calls, making sure that you have time scheduled to check in with all the members of the team at once so they can get a complete status update on some of these long-term investigations is really beneficial. Because we can use that information that we get from those to help you think about different queries we can help you run. If we can try to collect some additional sources where we think evidence might be that we didn't initially collect, and assisting with any type of protocol and protective measure that we might need to throw in there because you're getting stonewalled by one of the custodians. So remember that investigations are full of what I call rinse and repeat, right? We interrogate things, we get some decent findings, we find out that we have some holes, and we have to go back. And we have to keep going back until we feel like we've filled in most of the puzzle. Forensic analysis can literally just be used along the way to help you filter out a bunch of stuff so that when you're looking at the base facts and you're getting ready to think about your reporting, we've really helped you narrow it down. Oh boy, expert services. Discovery's had a weird year with opposing forensic experts. And I don't mean opposing in the sense of we were up against them in court. I mean, we got contacted multiple times this year to essentially clean up a bad forensic exam. where the client did not necessarily get something that was user-friendly, where they might not have even got what they asked for at all. We had one client who literally got like a shakedown where the person said, yeah, I found stuff, but I'm not going to give you results unless you pay me extra. So what we try to tell people is, when you're trying to pick a forensic expert, make sure that you know that that expert is going to produce some quality results. That's why word of mouth referrals are great in the digital forensics community. But also to make sure that they're going to be able to testify to it, that they're used to writing expert reports. That's a really key component here. Because think about the internal investigation matters that we work on. Typically, when we start working on a trade secret case, we work on it before it's ever filed in court. Somebody just suspected that something interesting was happening. And so we're able to take all that work that we did, write an affidavit for it, attach it, with our report, and they can give it to the court to help get that TRO. So whenever you're looking for a forensic expert, you always want to make sure that they have the ability to take it from start to finish. Because what's going to cost you more in the long run is if you have to switch forensic examiners, because the new company is going to have to get up to speed. There's going to probably be some reperformance of work, and you're not necessarily going to feel good, and your pocket's going to hurt a lot more. So make sure you vet that examiner. And just remember, the whole reason you want an expert is so if you go to court, they can help you authenticate all this work that's done. And that is where I landed. So Will, what do we got on the request line?
Well, we do have a couple of questions that have come in. If anyone has any questions they'd like to submit for Melody, please enter them in the Q&A box within Zoom. But we have two here to be able to start off with.
Ooh.
If I'm working on a matter where a client suspects a former employee of leaving with sensitive information, how do I determine which devices or accounts to be able to request in a motion to preserve?
Oh, that's a really good question. So typically what we do with clients, especially if they don't know a lot about the other potential devices that they're using, is we'll do an initial trade secret workup on the things that you have at the company. So looking at the company computer and the company email, maybe some other accounts that you might have. And we take that data and we analyze it to look to find any artifacts that might suggest other things had been plugged in or accessed from these devices. A really good example is USB devices. When we image that word computer, we're able to pull off the serial numbers, the dates and times that things were plugged in. So you're able to use that to make a request. And we do the same thing with personal email accounts. We dig through those internet artifacts to see if we can identify any of those accounts. Same time, especially on work computers, we like to see if phones were ever plugged in so that we can get some make, model, serial numbers of the phones that may have been used on those computers as well. So typically, that's a really good way to start. But you can also essentially make a request where you list out what's known, but say, and any and other all devices that would meet this criteria. So it will give you a really good start, and then through that process, you'll be able to start requesting some additional information as well.
Okay, great. So next question is, would a sparse collection look at unallocated spaces?
No. So that's the hard part about a sparse collection. That's one of the things that you lose out on, is the ability to look at all of that free space. Because typically what we're doing is looking at the file system. We're looking at specific documents, maybe we're pulling some logs, but traditionally we're not looking at the free space and all the other stuff that may have previously existed on a device. So if deleted data is something that you're really interested in, a full collection is the best way to get that information.
Okay, there's a two-part question that I will answer the first part and then reach out to the asker offline to be able to answer the second part. The first part is, could you provide a cost estimate to mirror, and in this case, preserve a forensic image of a 100 gig hard drive?
Sure. So in our office, the way that we typically do pricing for hard drives is as long as it's a terabyte or under, we usually are looking at like the $500 range. For really small devices, for those little USB sticks, typically it's only $350. So it really depends on, the type of data that's stored on there and what it is. So if this is an actual external hard drive, it would probably be on the 500, but if it's the USB drive, it would be more in the 350.
So last question that we have on here is, you've talked about a lot of reactive tactics. Are there any proactive measures that can be taken for alleviating internal investigations?
Yes. I talked about a lot of those in my November presentation. So if you go to the For Discovery website under webinars, I have a pretty decent set of them for that. And that information is also in the CEP magazine article that just came out, is a lot of the proactive measures. And so some of the things that you can do up front to gather additional information that takes down some of the burdening here, because it either A, alleviates the possibility of this type of an issue from happening in the first place, or B, just gives you a better roadmap of working through things.
Okay, and then also along the line of questions with the sparse collection, when you perform a sparse collection, can you provide keywords so only items with those words can be collected?
Yeah, so I'll use a really great example of where this has worked well. We worked on a very large piece of class action litigation where entire departments of a state had basically different servers, and those different servers held different types of information. And so in order to collect things that we thought were only responsive to this, we created a set of keywords, and we used a special piece of software that ran across the environment, indexed it, keyword searched it, and only collected those responsive documents. So it is an option. The one thing that I always caution people with, though, is if you use certain types of keywords, especially names of people, or names that could commonly be misspelled, if we don't add some of those alternative spellings and some of the other things that we can think of that might need to be included, you might miss some documents that are still relevant in that type of a collection. So trying to keep in mind that we can structure it however we want to, just got to be a little more careful in that context.
Okay. And another one that has come in, how often do you actually have clients that are well prepared for large scale collections?
I up until recently, I really I would have laughed a lot more. But over time, most of the clients that we've worked with who have been through this rodeo at least once have gotten light years better at it. So we actually have one that's going on right now that's working very well. It's a remote collection project, and that attorney literally comes to us with the name, address, phone number, email address, types of accounts, types of phones. Like, that's the first email I get for every custodian, is literally the set of information that we need to get everything ready to send out the kit and contact them to set up a time for collection. So it does get better, but yes, you are right that it can be tricky, and it's not always expected, which is why it's easier to talk to us early on so we can help you get better prepared for that.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Melody. So this concludes our Q&A session. Melody, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Nope, just communicate, and we're always here to answer questions and help you out the way that we can. So if you think you're going to have some type of sticky situation, just feel free to give us a call and we'll help.
Great. Thanks, Melody. And thank you everyone for attending. A follow-up email with all the materials from today's webinar, including video and presentation deck, will arrive in your inbox tomorrow. If you submitted your Illinois bar number during registration, your CLE certificate will be sent out next week. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great rest of your day.